Hello, and welcome to Young Heretics, where today we are talking about the question, is Joe Biden my president? And actually, I want to talk about a larger question than just, is Joe Biden my president? Because, I think that a lot of my listeners lean conservative, but actually one of the things I appreciate is that I also hear a lot from people that aren't conservative or middle of the road or even liberal, and they like the content of the show. They like classical education is indeed for everybody, even though I believe it implies certain valuable principles that you actually can't go against even in the political realm. Nevertheless, right, what I'm trying to say is we're a broad tent here. So not everybody that I know is listening to my voice would be inclined to say something like Joe Biden is #not my president. But it's striking to me actually that before Joe Biden was in office, we had a lot of people on the left saying Trump, not my president, right? He's not my president. And so there are kind of two schools of thought here. And I'm leaving aside for a second the idea that, Biden's not my president because he wasn't legitimately elected, right? I've expressed my views on that many times in this show. I do believe he won the election. So I'm really just talking about he's not my president because he's such a dolt or because he's so mentally unfit, right? Because he's sort of left the room, he's vacant, he's the puppet of X, Y, and Z special interests, right? And with Trump too, it's always he's not my president because he's Putin's puppet, or he's not my president because he's such a racist, or he's not my president because X, Y, and Z. That's one school of thought. It's if this person is so atrocious and you are a free person, you don't have to recognize the right of this terrible person to rule over you. And the other school of thought is the kind of, I respect the office, but not the man school of thought, right? Which is much more emotionally difficult and draining, and puts a huge strain on our moral faculties, but which says, America as a country, she's in terrible times, she's in dire straits, and yet she is my country. I love her. I believe in her. I think she's the great country of the world, the great hope of the West. And I have such high respect for her institutions and for her political leaders in the abstract, that I am going to salute when Joe Biden walks by, or I'm going to, watch when Trump does his State of the Union, or, whatever. I'm going to call him Mr. President. I respect the office. I believe in America. And actually, it turns out that this goes even deeper, if you think about it, than this or that president, but goes into the foundations of the idea of having a country, right? Right now, America itself, it looks a way that I would suspect a lot of us are very dissatisfied with. I know I am. And I talk to kids, people younger than me, if you can imagine that there are, in fact, people younger than me. And I'm starting to feel like not that young a heretic myself, right? I'm 31 now. I always forget. But yeah, I'm 31 now. So I talk to kids who grow up and they've been living in an America that was they don't remember 9/11. And so they've always felt as if the government is in these forever wars overseas, and they're being taught what they know to be crazy nonsense in school. They lost a couple years of their youth to COVID, and they look around at America. And I talked about this with Charles Kessler, who's the editor of the Claremont Review of Books on our Claremont Review of Books podcast. They look around and they see, as Charles points out, an America that is not a pretty sight. And they've never seen another America. They've never known, right, that this country could be great. And even I, who am relatively young, I grew up in the 90s, and I saw, even from abroad in London, but also when we moved here, I saw, the flowering, the height really of the best time to be alive anywhere on earth ever, right? And even before that, of course, you have the greatest generation who believed so firmly in what this country was. And we look back on the history of this country, and those of us who have lived through some good times are able to say, right, there is such a thing as America. I don't like America as currently constituted. I don't like what's happened to America. I don't like what America now means, what it exports around the world, what it does in other countries. We can be critical of all that while still saying, but America as a country is worth fighting for, worth saving, still good, right? There are a lot of people, a lot of kids, especially on the conservative movement and on the right, who look at the America they grew up in, and they have to conclude that actually there was never anything any good about this, and it was always doomed to failure. The revolution itself was an inherently kind of, postmodern project because it stripped away, this is not my view, but I'm kind of trying to represent this to you, right? Stripped away all tradition and just created this endlessly liberal, classically liberal society with no boundaries on what could be said or done. And eventually we were bound to end up at Drag Queen Story Hour. I don't believe that. But I think that in order to maintain the belief that America is good and good as founded and that our regime is beautiful, you need to have this distinction between what you see around you, what's happening in our fallen world, what's happening in our dark times, and this distinction between what's happening in the world you see around you, in our fallen world, in our dark times. You need to distinguish between that and the nation itself, or the essence of America and what America was founded to be and can be and still has the potential to be again, right? That is the distinction that we make when we say things like Joe Biden's a terrible president, he's doing a terrible job, but he's my president. And there is a certain, I'm not therefore going to take up arms against the government, right? I'm going to try to weather this within the system of America rather than breaking it apart. This very question, this concern, it turns out, is one of the governing concerns of Shakespeare's history plays. And so that's why I'm talking about it today, is because it is time for another Shakespeare. We're going through all of Shakespeare on Young Heretics, and we're going through different genres each time. So I'll start with, I did a tragedy first, then I think it's tragedy, history, comedy. I can't remember. All I remember is it's time for a history play. And we're going through them in chronological order according to subject, not in the order that Shakespeare wrote them, but in order of history, so that we can also talk about the history of England, which is one of our special interests as Americans, right? We come from England. And so that's a big part of the West that we care about. And I want you to be educated in the history of the English kings. And I want you to have at least thought about every play Shakespeare ever wrote. You probably should read every play Shakespeare ever wrote, because even though he can be difficult to understand in parts, he is nevertheless really the foundation stone, the modern foundation stone of our language. And he was a genius. So let's talk about Richard II. Let me offer you some free stuff from Public Goods. These guys are great. I mean, you should take free stuff whenever people offer it to you, but you should especially take free stuff from Public Goods because they have such excellent, high quality products. All kinds of basics, from coffee to toilet paper and shampoo to pet food. I have basically just stocked my entire kitchen with their their soaps and their snacks, and just my pantry is full of those chocolate covered almonds that I can't shut up about. My cat can't shut up about the freeze-dried duck nibs, which I just love to say the word freeze-dried duck nibs. Anyway, the point of all this is that their packaging looks great in your kitchen or in your home, wherever you want to put it, and their materials, their products are made with just clean stuff. You don't get any of these like crazy chemicals that you might find snuck in at the grocery store, no stuff you can't pronounce. I'm a bit of a health nut, so I love knowing that the stuff I'm putting into my body and using in the world is clean. Public Goods delivers that, and they deliver it at a high quality, and they've worked out this incredible deal for my listeners. When you go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use the code heretics at checkout, that's publicgoods.com/heretics, or use the code heretics at checkout, you will get $15 off your first Public Goods order with no minimum purchase. $15 worth of free stuff. What are you, stupid? Go get it. Go to publicgoods.com/heretics to claim your $15 off. So the first history play we did, we've only done one history play so far, and it was John, King John, right? And we did it again because that was the earliest king that Shakespeare wrote a play about. It was not the first history play he wrote. In fact, it was late. And this play that we're doing today is also not the first history play that he wrote, but it is the next in the sequence. So we need to do a little bit of catching up, because we've talked all the time on this show in many different contexts about King John, worst king ever, worst king in all of history. King John was a shit, right? We say this all the time. He failed in a million different ways. I'm not going to rehash that part of it so much, just except to say that we end John's reign with Magna Carta, the Barons' War, this crisis really of the crown and the regime, which tilts British law and history, and therefore American law and history, irrevocably away from kind of autarkic, autocratic power, establishes this idea that the king's rights come from God, that they are bound to God, and that the church has a role to play, or God himself has a role to play in mediating between the king and other powers, so on and so forth. John dies, as we talked about when we talked about during William Marshall's life. What happens next is the boy king, Henry III, mounts the throne. He is what's known as the first Plantagenet ruler. John was the last of the Angevin dynasty, so named because they were not only kings of England, but also nobles in France. We've talked about this at some length too, and their seat of their French power was at Anjou. And there's, that territory is part of what John loses. So that's another reason why he's remembered so unfavorably. And the Plantagenets also, right, have a seat in Anjou. But the Angevin dynasty is now over. We've got a new dynasty, the Plantagenets, starting with Henry III, the boy king. He is shepherded through some difficult times by William Marshal as his regent. And from now on, we're going to have Plantagenets all the way until the Tudors take over in 1485. And that will basically lead us up to Shakespeare's day, because Shakespeare is under Elizabeth at the end of the Tudor period. Then comes James in the Jacobean period. And so really Shakespeare's histories are almost entirely about the Plantagenet era, an incredibly turbulent era. And one mystery that I have been pondering, and anybody who has good ideas about this is welcome to write in and tell me what you think. Maybe head over to locals, youngheretics.com/locals. We will talk about this idea a little bit more. But as I've been rereading these plays, it occurred to me, right? So as I said, he doesn't write them in chronological order. He actually starts with this set of 4 plays focusing on Henry VI. And that's the first kind of tetralogy, right? 4-play sort of set, which is later. So we won't get to those for a while, because then he writes the what's called the Henriad, which starts with Richard II. So we're starting the Henriad today. And that goes from Richard II up to Henry V. But between the Henriad and John, there are 3 Edwards, right? There are 3 other kings that Shakespeare does not write plays about, except perhaps a play about Edward III, which he may have collaborated on with another writer. We're not reading that because it's not a Shakespeare play, properly speaking. But you have Edward I, Edward II, and Edward III, none of whom Shakespeare himself devotes his own play to. And it's not like he's trying to give an exhaustive account of the history of England, and time is limited and whatever. But it is kind of interesting that he goes back in time. He says, okay, so I've done the Henrys. Now I'm going to go back in time before Richard. What should I do next? And there's like a lot of stuff that happens. Edward I, famous for conquering Wales. So that's kind of a big deal. Edward II is a bit of a disaster. So that's sort of interesting. He's known for his sort of unusual and ineffectual reign. Edward III, major kind of restoration, not the restoration, but he restores the glory of the crown, institutionalizes chivalry with the Order of the Garter. We've talked about that before. So interesting sort of social dimension there, and gets the 100 Years' War rolling, which will dominate English politics for 100 years. In fact, more than 100 years. 1337 to 1453 is the 100 Years' War. Edward III declared himself the rightful heir to the French throne in 1337. That's why the 100 Years' War kind of got rolling. So all of this stuff, all I'm saying here, and that was, by the way, an attempt to undo the problems of John, right? He was trying to get back the territory in that John had lost, and we're going to get a lot of that in Henry V, because the 100 Years' War is still going on by Henry V, right? All I'm saying is, why did he not do any of that? Maybe it's just, he just didn't. Maybe I'm just making a problem where there is none, but I've been speculating a lot, like, what was it about that subject matter? Was it that Elizabeth and James were sort of attached to one of those kings, didn't want to revisit the problems of Edward II? I don't know, but I'm fascinated by it. It's kind of an unresolved Shakespearean mystery for me. But it does suggest, actually, one thing it seems is possible. One thing that I've wondered whether his sort of ignoring the Edwards is because he has this interest in the French kind of disputes with the English over the crown and territory, and in civil war, because one of the things that we're going to learn as we read Richard II is that Shakespeare really lays at the feet of Richard, in some senses unjustly, lays at Richard's feet the War of the Roses, which is going to become a major feature of our discussions as we move forward in these plays. War of the Roses after Richard's reign, so not in the play Richard II, but is a civil war that kind of emerges in the power vacuum that Shakespeare portrays Richard as having left. Richard is a kind of capricious tyrant in this play. And that's why I began by talking about this question: what do you do when the ruler is bad, but you believe in the state? In England, the way that this is kind of most dramatized, the way the sort of most dramatic version of this is to say, well, the king comes from God, right? Is ordained by God to rule, and this was a major belief, right? And you have readings of this play, especially in the modern era, which kind of focus on this problem. But it's not just a modern concern; it's really deep in the text. This thing that Richard is kind of a brat. He's sort of arbitrary. He seems to be veering toward tyranny in all sorts of ways that we're going to get into, and he has these loyal followers and friends even, who believe in the crown, but not in him. And they are terribly wrought with uncertainty about what to do, right? In Shakespeare's telling, that is kind of the situation that kicks off the War of the Roses. Because what happens in Richard II, and I give you all sorts of spoilers in these ones because they're history plays. So the point is not what happens, but how it happens, right? In Richard II, we basically have a forced abdication. Henry Bolingbroke, who is Richard's cousin, ends up taking the crown from him. And this is a seismic event, and it will lead to, or it will be followed by, this war between the Lancasters and the Yorks. So the situation is that Richard is the grandson of Edward III, who, remember, was the last king before him. Edward's son, the Black Prince, died, and so it was therefore the crown fell to the inheritor of the oldest son. Edward himself had 7 sons, and so what you have is this grandson of Edward who is ruling among all of these kind of leftover uncles who are very hot-headed themselves, the dukes, right? You have John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and Edmund of Langley, Duke of York. And these factions are going to become the factions that are going to struggle and fight and do battle for power over England. And all of it, in Shakespeare's view, emerges out of this vacuum, the kind of characterological failings of this man to live up to, admittedly, the incredibly difficult task of being God's anointed, God's representative on earth. And in many ways, this Henriade is an extended meditation on what an incredible burden that is. And we have the legacy of that everywhere around us. This is like a central Western way of thinking about political power, even though we no longer have kings. Nevertheless, we have sacred duties that come to us in the government, and we are fallen humans, and we step into these roles with fear and trembling. And this play is a beautiful depiction of that. Some of the most beautiful and stirring monologues about this conflict, right? The conflict between the real necessity of divinely ordained kings to keep the peace and the order, the chaos that will come if anybody can just rebel and revolt, when they don't like the king, right? That's all defended very eloquently in the play. And yet, nevertheless, this is a terrible king. And how bad does it have to get before things fall apart? So let's get into it. Let's start reading some of Shakespeare's wonderful language. I will mention that there are multiple versions of this play. There are 3 quartos between 1597 and 1598. Quarto is a sort of smaller edition. Then you have the 1623 first folio, and it's not until the first folio that you have a scene we're going to read some of today, the Deposition Scene. There's a shorter version in the 4th quarto, which is from 1608. Who knows why this is? Some people think maybe it was too spicy, the deposition scene, for the crown to admit, and there was censorship involved. We don't know. But what we do have is the play as is. And I'm reading, as always, from my Folger Shakespeare Library editions. Thank you to the Folger Library for sending me those editions. I love them. I love them. I love them. They have facing page notes, which is so nice. And really just beautiful works. So let's start at the beginning. There is a duel between Henry Bolingbroke, who is, remember, the son of John of Gaunt, which makes him the cousin of Richard himself. There is a duel between Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. There's an accusation that Mowbray has misused crown funds, and there's serious accusations are made of treason and all sorts of terrible things. Bolingbroke challenges Mowbray to a duel. Richard postpones it and ends up sort of allowing it to happen, but then stopping it from happening, and basically deciding that it's too risky to have this death of these one of these major people, and so he banishes Mowbray and Bolingbroke, but Mowbray gets banished for life, and Bolingbroke is banished for 10 years, and then John of Gaunt pleads with him, and it's amended to 6. And so right off the bat, we come to understand that this is a capricious monarch, somebody who is ruling in ways that seem arbitrary, seem to express favoritism. Major charge against him is that he has allowed flatterers into his kind of inner circle who are manipulating him, and that he's putting England up essentially for sale. So Bolingbroke, who is going to become a really controversial figure because he's going to take the crown and become Henry IV, Bolingbroke is kind of, we understand why the people who are on his side, including, for example, John of Gaunt, right? Why those people feel that Richard is causing a crisis of the state. The first scene I want to read to you is Act 2, Scene 1. Remember that Shakespeare's plays are divided into 5 acts, and by and large, they are in blank verse, which is da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? So iambic pentameter, 10 syllables per line, 5 feet per syllable, each syllable an iamb, da-da, and you vary this, but that's basically the idea. So in Act 2, Scene 1, we have the death scene of John of Gaunt. So this scenario that I've just described has unfolded, and we have finally, Gaunt is in this terrible dilemma about whether to oppose Henry, and he says again and again, like, this power comes to him from God. God must redress the abuse because and this is in the Bible, of course. We've talked about this before, right? Submit to the powers. Political power comes from God. It goes right back to the New Testament, and Shakespeare is grappling with it. And so here's John of Gaunt, who at last, on his deathbed, makes his accusations against Richard of caprice and injustice. The Ancient Language Institute is where I send anybody who wants to get up close and personal with the great works of the West, especially, of course, the foundational texts that are written in Biblical Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. They teach all 3, and they teach them in this wonderful way that's highly intuitive. You don't spend all this time memorizing long lists of vocab and paradigm before you jump into the texts, because, of course, these are, at the time that they were used, they were living languages. They are now texts that are full of life, and you want to learn them in that kind of intuitive way, the way that you learned English, right? By studying sentences, by working with some of these wonderful books from Aristotle to the Bible to Cicero to Virgil. They teach all of these things so well, and they teach them to every level. So it doesn't matter if you're like on your PhD course or you've never even cracked the spine of a Plato text. Just go to ancientlanguage.com/heretics. It's ancientlanguage.com/heretics and get a 10% discount on tuition with the promo code Heretics. You can read the Bible in its original languages, the great Athenian philosophers, the Golden Age poetry of Rome, and more at ancientlanguage.com/heretics. They are my pals. I endorse them. They teach languages that changed my life, and they can change yours too. ancientlanguage.com/heretics. Gaunt says, this is one of the most famous monologues from the play: "Methinks I am a prophet, new inspired, and thus expiring do foretell of him. His rash, fierce blaze of riot cannot last, for violent fires soon burn out themselves. Small showers last long, but sudden storms are short. He tires betimes that spurs too fast betimes. With eager feeding food doth choke the feeder. Light vanity, insatiate cormorant, consuming means, soon preys upon himself. This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings, feared by their breed and famous by their birth, renowned for their deeds, as far from home for Christian service and true chivalry as is the sepulchre and stubborn Jewry of the world's ransom, Blessed Mary's Son. This land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out. I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or pelting farm, England, bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. That England that was wont to conquer others hath made a shameful conquest of itself. Ah, would this scandal vanish with my life! How happy then were my ensuing death. Shakespeare is now at the height of his powers. I mean, I defy anybody to disagree with me here that this play, I talked about how some of the other plays we've read, including King John, a little bit spottier, some good stuff, some of his, Shakespeare's still great, but like some of the lesser stuff is in that play. This play is just like one incredible moment after another. This dying man who expresses in this love for his nation, right? I mean, this is what you see, just the physical love of the land, right? The love of the earth. This is what we get too from, like, we make fun of boomers a lot, but boomers have this for America. And you need this for your country if you're going to fight for it, right? You need to believe that this is a special land. And there are many like it, but this one is mine. I've said that before, right? It's not that like we hate India or something, or we hate other countries. It's that this place is ours and we love it. And therefore we believe that it is beloved of God because God loves us, right? And so the specificity of it and the description of geographic England and the description of divine favor corrupted, right? And betrayed. And that's why he's so hateful toward Richard the man, right? And this is sometimes referred to as the King's Two Bodies. There was a book in 1957, Ernst Kantorowicz, about this very problem. And if you watch now the Crown, that Netflix series, it's all about this. Every miniseries or movie that's made about the English monarchy is basically about this. That movie they made recently about Diana, nobody's come up with anything more profound to say about the monarchs and their implications for political power than Shakespeare. Most things that you watch now, you'll now see it everywhere. Now that I've ruined every modern take on the British monarchy for you, you'll see it everywhere, and not just in stuff about England, but stuff about America too. This is the central conflict at the heart of politics in a fallen world, and you'll see it everywhere. It happens in The Crown. It happens in all the stuff that you watch about this project. It's all here. And so here's the conflict now. When Richard comes in, Gaunt says this to his face because he's dying, and he's hoping, unlike a flatterer, he's hoping by delivering a bitter pill to resolve or to help the king. Now he that made me knows I see thee ill in myself to see, and in thee seeing ill. Thy deathbed is no lesser than thy land, wherein thou liest in reputation sick, and thou, too careless patient as thou art, committ'st thy anointed body to the cure of those physicians that first wounded thee. 1,000 flatterers sit within thy crown, whose compass is no bigger than thy head, and yet encaged in so small a verge, the waste is no whit lesser than thy land. This is really, he's only a dying man could say this if he believed in the majesty of the crown, right? Because, of course, this is his last breath, essentially. Oh, had thy grandsire with a prophet's eye seen how his son's son should destroy his sons. He's talking about Edward III now. If Edward III had known, from forth thy reach he would have laid thy shame, deposing thee before thou wert possessed, which art possessed now to depose themselves. Why, cousin, wert thou regent of the world? It were a shame to let this land by lease. But for thy world enjoying but this land, is it not more than shame to shame it so? Landlord of England art thou now, not king. Thy state of law is bondslave to the law, and thou, King Richard interjects here, a lunatic, lean-witted fool, presuming on an ague's privilege, darest with thy frozen admonition make pale our cheek, chasing the royal blood with fury from his native residence. Now, by my seat's right royal majesty, wert thou not brother to great Edward's son, this tongue that runs so roundly in thy head should run thy head from thy unreverent shoulders. He's saying, presuming on an ague's privilege, meaning exactly what I just said, that because you're dying, you think you can say this to me the king. And Gaunt says, oh, spare me not, my brother Edward's son, for that I was his father Edward's son. That blood already, like the pelican, hast thou tapped out and drunkenly caroused. My brother Gloucester, plain, well-meaning soul, whom fair befall in heaven mongst happy souls, may be a precedent and witness good that thou respectest not spilling Edward's blood. Join with the present sickness that I have, and thy unkindness be like crooked age to crop at once a too long withered flower. Live in thy shame, but die not shame with thee. These words hereafter thy tormentors be. Convey me to my bed and to my grave. Love they to live that love and honor have. Wow. So you see already set up this dramatic conflict, and you see that Richard is conscious of his own majesty as God's anointed, that he's invoking here, and and Gaunt is basically saying only that privilege could have stopped me from deposing you already, essentially. Only the fact that you are my president, right? It would be the modern analog. I'm going to salute you, even though I seethe with loathing toward you. And this is a very noble thing, a very hard thing, and something you can only do if you truly believe that the country itself is something worth fighting for. I find this incredibly moving, and it only gets better from here. So the conflict that emerges between Bolingbroke and Richard goes something like this. And with all these history plays, sometimes you have to you sit through, if you're watching them, you have to sit through these sort of council scenes where they're talking about stuff that doesn't make any sense. There's a wonderful adaptation of Henry V, in which the opening of that play is this incredibly complicated argument over land rights and just all sorts of minutia. And in Kenneth Branagh's adaptation, Branagh is really, I think, the undisputed adapter of Shakespeare, and his Henry is incredible. But in that adaptation, it's sort of like nobody has any idea what's going on. Like they kind of make a joke out of it. So I'm going to do my best to just sort of summarize really quickly the kind of complicated situation that's going on here. Bolingbroke, remember, has been exiled, Henry Bolingbroke. While he's gone, Richard has undertaken to seize his lands to help fund a war in Ireland. So he's going to war with Ireland. The Welsh, who are at this point on the English side, are with him. He's mustering the Welsh to go to war with Ireland, but he's also taking people's property. Another thing that we thought we got over this with King John, right? This sort of arbitrary taxation, this seizure of land, this endlessly rapacious appetite for war and for conquest in order to cover over kind of personal failings on the part of the king. All of this is raising, bad memories from John. So this is kind of one of the major offenses that starts to turn people around and say, well, perhaps, this is such an offense against England itself that we must rebel, or we must kind of somehow succor Bolingbroke, who returns while Richard is in Ireland and announces an intention to claim his lands back. Thus begins Bolingbroke's attack upon Richard's coterie, his inner circle, including Bushy and Green. These are two kind of close allies of Richard's. And let's read what Bolingbroke says when he sentences them to death, because it also speaks again to what Bolingbroke's like and what he has in mind. So here he is, Bushy and Green. Bolingbroke says, "Bring forth these men, Bushy and Green. I will not vex your souls, since presently your souls must part your bodies. With too much urging your pernicious lives, for 'twere no charity, yet to wash your blood from off my hands, here in the view of men, I will unfold some causes of your deaths. You have misled a prince, a royal king, a happy gentleman in blood and lineaments, but you, unhappied and disfigured clean, you have in manner with your sinful hours made a divorce betwixt his queen and him." And we read in the notes that this is kind of not referenced elsewhere, but it seems that they've been whispering in his ear about his marriage, and made a divorce betwixt his queen and him, broke the possession of a royal bed, and stained the beauty of a fair queen's cheeks with tears drawn from her eyes by your foul wrongs. Myself, a prince by fortune of my birth, near to the king in blood and near in love, till you did make him misinterpret me, have stooped my neck under your injuries, and sighed my English breath in foreign clouds, eating the bitter bread of punishment, whilst you have fed upon my sinews, disparked my parks, and felled my forest woods. Sinews, right? You're saying you're taking my land and my possessions. From my own windows, torn my household coat, raised out my impress, leaving me no sign save men's opinions and my living blood to show the world I am a gentleman. This and much more than twice all this, condemns you to the death. See them delivered over to execution and the hand of death. It's a great speech, and you hear the authority, the kind of natural authority in his voice that Richard is lacking. Even the caprice, even the tyranny of Richard and the overly harsh measures that he takes in this play. Again, this is somewhat an unfair portrayal based on Shakespeare's source, which is Holinshed. But nevertheless, right, in the play, Richard has this very realistic attribute that is the attribute of bullies, which is that they sense this inadequacy in themselves. They feel that they're not living up to their offices, and therefore they have to lash out. You see this in Joe Biden all the time, right? Everybody can tell. He's shaking hands with thin air. He's wandering around. Obama's outshining him. All of these things are going on, and you see the way that he senses his inadequacy and lashes out at the unvaccinated. We have a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Now you understand why Joe Biden does that thing where he shouts randomly in the middle of his speeches, right? Is because this is how kings and rulers behave when they feel that they don't have enough dignity of their own to fill the crown or to fill the shoes of the president, right? They start yelling, right? And they start doing things that are overcompensating for their lack of gravitas. And Bolingbroke has gravitas. So he comes in, he sentences these men to death, but note that he attempts even still to sort of preserve in some way the dignity of Richard himself. He says, you have misled him, right? You are like Grima Wormtongue in Lord of the Rings. You've sort of seduced him away. You've done all these nasty things to him because Bolingbroke is not like inherently, I don't think, a revolutionary. And one of the central questions of this play going forward is going to be like, does he actually want the crown? Richard, in his paranoia, which is another feature, right, of people who sense themselves to be inadequate rulers, believes that Bolingbroke wants the crown. But it may be that Bolingbroke is simply trying to rectify what he perceived to be a grievous wrong done by the king against himself, but nevertheless not inherently, right, like cause for revolution. But nevertheless, this whole conflict begins to escalate because the next thing that Bolingbroke starts to do is to fight with Richard's Welsh allies. And Richard at this point comes back. So he's done this whole this whole war in Ireland. He hears about Bolingbroke, and then he hears that the Welsh have deserted him, that the Welsh are beginning to side with Bolingbroke or else to be defeated by him. And this is the central scene of the play. It's the most famous monologue in it, or the best line in the play, one of the best lines Shakespeare ever wrote. So the first thing he does when he comes back, Richard, is he proclaims his certainty of divine right? He sort of makes this show of bravado and flusters about it. But then it turns out that he's, as we know already, he's not enough to fill this role. It's all kind of show and bluster. He learns about the Welsh. He learns about his allies deserting him, and he basically crumples. So this is Act 3, Scene 2. We'll start with the, sort of show of bravado that he makes as he arrives. And then we'll move on to this famous monologue when he hears of how badly things stand. Richard says, "Discomfortable cousin, knowst thou not," he's talking to Almeril here, another one of his cousins. "Discomfortable cousin, knowst thou not that when the searching eye of heaven is hid behind the globe that lights the lower world, then thieves and robbers range abroad unseen in murders and in outrage boldly here? But when from under this terrestrial ball he fires the proud tops of the eastern pines and darts his light through every guilty hole, then murders, treasons, and detested sins, the cloak of night being plucked from off their backs, stand bare and naked, trembling at themselves. So when this thief, this traitor Bolingbroke, who all this while hath revelled in the night, whilst we were wandering with the Antipodes, shall see us rising in our throne, the east, his treasons will sit blushing in his face, not able to endure the sight of day, but self-affrighted, tremble at his sin. Not all the water in the rough rude sea can wash the balm off from an anointed king. The breath of worldly men cannot depose the deputy elected by the Lord. For every man that Bolingbroke hath pressed to lift shrewd steel against our golden crown, God for his Richard hath in heavenly pay a glorious angel. Then, if angels fight, weak men must fall, for heaven still guards the right." It's an impressive speech. We have to concede to him, right? And you can see he talks about himself almost as God himself, that when he arises like the sun, then evil will be known and will know itself and will know shame. This is exactly how Christians describe the apocalypse and the second coming, right? This sort of revelation of God so that all shall be resurrected, but those who are resurrected to damnation shall be damned because they see God and hate him, right? And nevertheless acknowledge him as God. So that's what's Richard is playing with here, is this imagery of that. And he says, you cannot depose me. You can't unanoint me. I am, it is God who gave me my power. And I think you cannot have this play, or you cannot have these ideas developed to such a beautiful extent without the Protestant Reformation. Shakespeare is writing under Elizabeth and James, post-Protestant Reformation. And as he explores also in Hamlet, which we'll get to there, Hamlet, remember, comes from the University of Wittenberg, where Luther was. When you have suggested that the Pope is not the final authority capable of opening up a direct line to God, you have created an epistemological and political crisis. You have unseated the idea, right, of how God communicates his will to earth so that we may know it certainly. And as a Protestant, I believe this is a tragic but necessary event because, indeed, popes are human. And I think that I'm a pretty good articulator and defender of Catholic ideas on this show. So my Catholic friends will forgive me for saying that I do not believe that the Pope, even under the very select circumstances that are delineated by the magisterium, I do not believe that the Pope can be infallible. And that's one of the major sticking points, obviously, of the Protestant Reformation. And I believe that Shakespeare is seeing in the poet's way, the poet's visionary way, the implication of that. Because if there is no certain access to divine truth, as I believe there is not, I believe we have intimation and faith in divine truth, but not certainty, not of the kind that we have about, empirical observations. Then we are in this crisis where, although it may be the case that God has a will for us, and although that will may have political implications, nevertheless, there are fallen human beings who are interpreting and discerning that will, and there come times when they fall so far short of their offices that in the course of human events, right, it comes necessary for one political body to dissolve the ties that have joined them to another. And what I'm suggesting to you here is that Shakespeare sees, not in particulars, but in principle, that the Protestant Reformation has created the exact situation in which the American Revolution will eventually happen. Because this is my answer, right, to our question of, is Joe Biden our president? Yes, he is, but Joe Biden, the man, is not therefore divine. And this is why we do not have kings. This is why the founders did away with kings, right? Is because they saw that what we are trying to discern is the will of God, and the will of God comes imperfectly as through a glass darkly here onto this earth. And that's what Shakespeare is seeing in Richard. It is amazing. I mean, it's truly an act, really, of divine inspiration. This makes me believe in divine inspiration. The fact that this playwright, who was living through these events, saw in the implications of them effectively the undermining of what had been monarchy up until that point. And these are subversive ideas, which he couldn't, certainly couldn't have said outright, and probably wouldn't have said outright, because he wasn't like writing a political treatise, he was writing a play. And this is why he makes Richard so much worse than he actually was, is to play this up and to kind of explore this profound idea. Let's talk about the fallout of it now. Every time I do an ad for American Hartford Gold, I feel like I have to update my references because things have gotten yet more expensive. It's like last time I talked about selling my house or mortgaging my house to buy a piece of steak. Now I feel like I have to talk about like declaring bankruptcy just because I filled up a tank of gas. Things are so expensive. Inflation is out of control. Government's printing money like there's no tomorrow. And that's why I am so glad that American Hartford Gold is my sponsor, because they are a great option for shoring up your savings and your investments against inflation. The way to do this is to put a portion of your portfolio into physical gold and silver. That is what American Hartford Gold can help you to do. And if you call them right now, they will give you up to $1,500 of free silver on your first qualifying order. That's $1,500 of free silver when you text the word Heretics, Heretics, to the number 65532. So one more time, you text the word Heretics, Heretics, to the number 65532, and you will get up to $1,500 of free silver on your first qualifying order. This is the inflation-proof way to help build the young Heretics empire. I want you all to be fabulously wealthy in addition to brilliant and fit. So go to American Hartford Gold now. Text Heretics to 65532. So Richard hears, and this is the famous monologue that I was talking about. Richard hears the situation that he finds himself in with Bolingbroke, and he delivers the following monologue in his despair. And we're still now in Act 3, Scene 2, this kind of pivotal scene in the middle of the play. Of comfort, no man speak. Let's talk of graves, of worms and epitaphs. Make dust our paper, and with rainy eyes write sorrow on the bosom of the earth. Let's choose executors and talk of wills, and yet not so. For what can we bequeath save our deposed bodies to the ground? Our lands, our lives, and all are Bolingbroke's, and nothing can we call our own but death, and that small model of the barren earth which serves as paste and cover to our bones. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings, how some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court. And there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little scene to monarchize, be feared, and kill with looks, infusing him with self and vain conceit, as if this flesh which walls about our life were brass impregnable, and humored thus, comes at the last, and with a little pin bores through his castle wall, and farewell, king. Cover your heads, and mock not flesh and blood with solemn reverence. Throw away respect, tradition, form, and ceremonious duty, for you have but mistook me all this while. I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me, I am a king? For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. Now, the transition, the flip, the about face from that monologue I read earlier, right? I will rise like the sun and cause shame to the sinner, to this objection, right? That the king is a mortal man and will go into the ground and be dust like the rest, right? And this whole thing is an illusion, right? Of course, it comes from Richard's own kind of frantic and capricious character, but it is also Shakespeare peering into the heart of things that undermines. It's a terrible, anguished realization for somebody in Shakespeare's position, for somebody in Richard's, right? But of course, cover your heads and I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends. Shakespeare, he has this reputation for being so hard to understand. And of course, like everybody from the ye olden times, it takes a little bit of doing to interpret some of his language. But at his best, when you actually get over your fear of him, he's so clear. I live with bread like you, taste grief, need friends, right? These monosyllables, many of them, and the kind of primal urgency of them, which is precisely the urgency of realizing that men are men and fallen, right? And the world is even more broken than we had assumed, which is why, of course, the founders abolished kingship. So again, brilliant. The one of his most famous lines, right? And you'll, if you just hear the monologue out of context, right? Let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. Very beautiful, nice idea. But the death of kings, right? When you're talking about kings as divinely or anointed figureheads of God on earth, right? That they die is a profound fact. So it's really just a brilliant personal drama and political drama and theological drama all in once. I want to read to you a couple more passages here. The fallout I've basically already indicated is that Richard is convinced that Bolingbroke wants the crown. He offers him all these things, and again, in his sort of weakness and his caprice, starts to snowball into more and more offers. Right, he offers to make him heir to the throne, and then Bolingbroke eventually, having at some point, if he wasn't already, he now is essentially trying to. He sees that Richard is unfit to serve, and he takes over. He has Richard depose himself, and he crowns himself Henry the Fourth. Eventually, he's going to have Sir Piers of Exton is going to kill Richard. It's unclear whether Henry wants it. Again, quite possible that he does, but he makes this reference to my living fear, as if the fact that Richard lives means that he is unsecure in his own crown, and so Richard is going to end up killed. But before then, we have some very moving interchanges and discussions around the deposition. This is the deposition scene that I was telling you about. That it's cut in some versions. But let me just read to you a monologue of Richard's from this scene. He says to Northumberland, "No lord of thine." Northumberland says, my lord, And King Richard interrupts him, no lord of thine, though thou hot insulting man, nor no man's lord. I have no name, no title, no, not that name was given me at the font, but 'tis usurped. Alack, the heavy day, that I have worn so many winters out, and know not now what name to call myself. Oh, that I were a mockery king of snow, standing before the son of Bolingbroke, to melt away in water drops, good king, great king, and yet not greatly good. And if my word be sterling yet in England, let it command a mirror hither straight, that it may show me what a face I have, since it is bankrupt of his majesty. The way that these themes and motifs and images, you can when you read these plays, you can track them perhaps a little better than when you see them. We had the sun, right? Richard himself rising like the sun. Now we have Richard as a king of snow melting in the true sun of Bolingbroke. And we had earlier, the Gaunt says that your crown is only as big as your temples. And then in Richard's famous monologue, we have, around the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of the king. So this idea, these ideas that kind of get played out throughout the course of the text are so masterfully manipulated. And this is, of course, why he was also so great at sonnets, right? Is he has this perfect way of rhyming images and ideas against each other. Richard is deposed. I want to read one last monologue of his before we kind of draw this tour through the play to a close. But if you only read, a few history plays, this really should be one of them. It's just one of the masterworks up there, I think, with Henry V and Richard III, all of which we will get to. But let me read now the farewell to kingship. In Act 5, Richard communes with his wife and basically gives her the news that it's all over. And here's their exchange. The queen says, this way the king will come. This is the way to Julius Caesar's ill-erected tower, to whose flint bosom my condemned lord is doomed a prisoner by proud Bolingbroke. Here let us rest, if this rebellious earth have any resting for her true king's queen. The idea that the earth itself is rebelling, right? That the foundational order of the universe is being unsettled, right? Again, very plainly, to me at least, inspired by the catastrophes of the present era, namely the Protestant Reformation, which, even if, like me, you're a Protestant, you have to concede, unsettled the world, right? So the idea that the earth would rebel. But soft, but see, or rather do not see, my fair rose wither. Yet look up, behold, that you in pity may dissolve to dew and wash him fresh again with true love tears. Ah, thou, the model where old Troy did stand, thou map of honor, thou King Richard's tomb, and not King Richard, thou most beauteous inn. Why should hard-favored grief be lodged in thee when triumph is become an alehouse guest? King Richard says, join not with grief, fair woman, do not so. To make my end too sudden, learn, good soul, to think our former state a happy dream, from which awaked the truth of what we are shows us but this. I am sworn brother sweet to grim necessity, and he and I will keep a league till death. Hie thee to France, and cloister thee in some religious house. Our holy lives must win a new world's crown, which our profane hours here have thrown down. The passing of a dream, right, which comes up again and again as sort of an obsession of Shakespeare's. In The Tempest, right, everything, all of this was but a dream. You have all but slumbered here while these visions did appear. You can cite play after play, and we've seen some of them already, like The Forest of Arden has this idea in As You Like It, that this is a kind of dream court where the true king lives, but also is living in a kind of Edenic land. And here it was a happy dream, this vanishing away, the melting of all things solid. Truly the mood, right? I mean, this is another thing that poets do, is they grasp the zeitgeist, they see the mood of what's going on, and that's the governing mood here, is this kind of just melting of solidity. We are still, right, always up against this. And unfortunately, we live, as Heraclitus observed, all is in flux. We live in a world, right, of flesh that decays. And that is why, although hard though we may try, right, to establish some perfect system that's going to endure for all time, nevertheless, we must always be returning to our principles and revitalizing. This is why I'm not as despairing as some of my friends about America, is like, yes, of course, we have lost sight of our principles. Yes, our country is in dire straits, but you know what? That's the story of all great nations. Israel, right, famous in the Bible, constantly following after other gods, turning away from God, having to return, right, repent, come back to the source. And because the source is ever living, and because it comes from God, and because it's ever new, no human institution can capture it. And this is the tragedy of Richard II, right? This is what Shakespeare is seeing, even as, he is a subject of the crown. again, incredibly dangerous ideas to be flirting with, even if they're kind of couched in this play, bold and honest, right, for Shakespeare to deal with this. Let's read a little bit more of it. What is my Richard, both in shape and mind, transformed and weakened? Hath Bolingbroke deposed thine intellect? Hath he been in thy heart? The lion dying thrusteth forth his paw and wounds the earth, if nothing else, with rage to be o'erpowered. And wilt thou, pupil-like, take the correction, mildly kiss the rod, and fawn on rage with base humility, which art a lion and the king of beasts? King Richard, a king of beasts indeed. If aught but beasts, I had been still a happy king of men. Good sometime, queen, prepare thee hence for France. Think I am dead, and that even here thou takest, as from my deathbed, thy last living leave. In winter's tedious nights sit by the fire with good old folks, and tell thee tales of woeful ages long ago betide. And ere thou bid good night, to quite their griefs, tell thou the lamentable tale of me, and send the hearers weeping to their beds. For why the senseless brands will sympathize the heavy accent of thy moving tongue, and in compassion weep the fire out. And some will mourn in ashes, some coal black, for the deposing of a rightful king. This stuff sets my hair on fire. I don't know about you, but I just like, when you get into Shakespeare, there's really no one like him. This is why he was a genius, is because of what he saw. There's a wonderful essay by Bernard Knox, whom I mentioned before. He was a friend of Fagel's, who translated my favorite translation of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Knox wrote an essay, The Poet as Prophet. It was about Euripides and the fact that one word for poet in Latin is vates, which is seer. And Knox argues that the seer is a visionary, not because he can actually predict the future, but because so many people are always living in the past. We talked last week about how these old political slogans kind of hang on, and we're still fighting the fight from 10 years ago, and we're not seeing clearly what's going on in the here and now. And I think that Knox is arguing that poets are those who see the present, and because they see the present, they can see so much contained in it of what is to come. And Shakespeare certainly qualifies as that kind of prophet, that sort of seer, who looks into the heart of his moment, knows what is going on, can chart it back through history, but can also kind of feel his way to the spirit of the age, which will unfold and is still unfolding, I think, with us now. We do not believe in the divine right of kings. That's why we're Americans. We do believe, however, in divine rights, right? We believe in God, and we believe in God's endowment of his creatures, namely us, with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and recovering that, instantiating it, reifying it, revitalizing it in our political system is our task. And yes, always human endeavor will eventually fail, but we're not done yet. And our crisis, which is essentially the crisis of failed leadership, is resolvable precisely because we have the wisdom of people like Shakespeare informing even the very structure of our nation to guide us forward. Last week, I told you all about the East India Trading Company. Today, I am telling you about Gold River Trading Company. They are the American tea company. So East India, right, was the Brits exerting their monarchy and taxing the Americans and all sorts of ugly, nasty stuff. None of those problems with Gold River Trading Company. Plus, it's excellent tea. They have their 1776 American Breakfast Blend, their black tea. They have gunpowder green tea. I am back on caffeine because I am done with Lent. Lent is over, and therefore I have drunk to my fill of all their excellent teas. They really are great. It's hard to get good tea in America, in part because we dumped it in the ocean. But now we have Gold River Trading Company to fix this problem and to introduce Americans to high quality tea. They have 6 blends in premium pyramid sachets, 1 loose leaf tea, and 1 hot cocoa. If you want non-caffeinated options, they have them. When you go to goldrivercode.com, you can get 10% off just by using the offer code Heretics. This is only for my listeners. You go to goldrivercode.com, use the offer code Heretics, Heretics, and get 10% off this entire line of excellent, high-quality American tea. goldrivercode.com, 10% off with the offer code Heretics. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals. Locals is a platform created by my buddy Dave Rubin. Dave is a staunch defender of free speech, and therefore, when he saw what was going on in big tech platforms, he undertook to build something of his own, incredibly admirable and incredibly successful. This is a great platform. Nobody owns the relationship between us on Locals except for us. And that means that nobody can shut us up. So come over to youngheretics.com/locals, become a VIP. You'll get all sorts of extra goodies. You can also help support the show and carry it forward if you believe in this stuff and the necessity of it. This is one of the major ways to help us. Another big way is to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and to tell your friends about the show, all of which would be heartily appreciated. Let's take a mailbag question from Locals VIP Steve. Your Marvel episode was really, really cool. Oh, thank you. This is from a while back. I did an episode on Marvel movies and the multiverse, and I'm going to be writing more about that in the future, so keep an eye out. In the same spirit, do you recommend any video games with perennial themes? Yes, this is also something that I have written about to a certain extent. Unfortunately, I just played a video game called The Shadow of Rome, which I didn't like very much. I have to confess that I don't love these games that are mostly about like asking the right questions out of a list of like 112 possible questions. Shadow of Rome was really popular. I think it was I believe that it's originally a patch-in, like a kind of expansion pack for Elder Scrolls. I think I got that right. But anyway, Shadow of Rome. If you're interested in Roman history, you might be interested in it. It's got some kind of cool speculation and philosophy about the gods and like whether the gods are just in ancient Roman theology or ancient Roman mythology. But unfortunately, the gameplay of that one was not so great. I do have a few to recommend to you, however, one of which is called Braid, Braid, which is kind of, I don't want to spoil it because it has a surprise ending, but it's got incredibly innovative gameplay. And the gameplay, one of the things that I love about it, because I do believe that video games are an art form, a new kind of art, the form of the gameplay, the style of the puzzles, which are so fun to play, also express something about what the game is saying. So I would check that one out. It's about the hero quest, but it's about the hero quest in a kind of surprising and subversive way. I think that games are really good about the hero quest. I wrote in an article for Law and Liberty called An Art That Offers Choices. I wrote that video games are kind of where the hero myth went as art became more and more abstract in the 70s, that RPGs kind of emerged to fill that role, first in tabletop form in Dungeons and Dragons. And then, another series that I really love is Final Fantasy. I think that Final Fantasy VII especially, and also a recent creation by the same guy, although not in the Final Fantasy series, called Fantasian, sorry, with an N at the end, has like these wonderful themes of memory, which we've talked a little bit about on the show too, like the necessity, the humanity of memory in the face of machines. That's kind of a fixation of the Final Fantasy series. I think that we will do some episodes on some of these, I think, because they're really worth going into in greater detail. But another one that has a kind of beautiful mythic quality to it is Ico. I think you can only get that on PlayStation 1. You might have to, patch in some kind of simulator or something if you don't have an old console. But I loved Ico. It's probably my favorite game ever. And these are, I think, very great examples of how you can use the visual capacities of video games and the added dimension of controls and actual game elements to tell stories in new ways. Final Fantasy 15, another one that does this. So all games that I'm big on and would heartily recommend. Inside is another one that kind of works this way a little bit. That one's very mythic, kind of, just these basic, simple themes, which is often the thing that works very well in video games too, is for suggestive imagery. There was a computer game called Heart of Darkness that did this very well back in the day. That's a classic. If you guys don't know that one, that one's fantastic. I could go on and on, Steve, and I will on Locals. When you go to youngheretics.com/locals, we can talk more about this on our weekly live streams. But those are some titles that I think have really captured what Joseph Campbell would have called the monomyth, right? This idea that there are certain patterns of behavior and experience that's woven into the world. Tolkien and Lewis, of course, thought that this was an indicator of the reality that Christ is a kind of archetype for all human life, and that it's always lived out in mythology in some way or another. And I think that that video games have really tapped into that. The hero myth in video games. You can check out some of my writing on this again at Law and Liberty, and we'll talk more about it on Locals. Thanks for that question, Steve, and thank you all so much for being with me. I do love doing the show. I love talking to you about the greats of the West, and I think that they're important for reasons that I hope have become clear over the last hour or so. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute, where I work. It's a think tank for the recovery of the American idea, which we've talked a lot about this week and last. And we put out 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. You can donate to support our work at claremont.org/donate. When you do, mention Young Heretics in the notes so that they'll know we sent you. All right, folks, that's it from me. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.